Hello, today's video will be on the Westerness of Django Unchained. In order to do this, we will be using the three W's. What is a Western, how Django Unchained meets the Western motifs, and why director and writer Quentin Tarantino chose the Western style to represent a Southern story. In answering these questions, we will get a greater sense of how the use of different historical genres can be used to represent distinctly different historical stories.
Django, have you always been alone? Django, have you never loved again? Love will live on, life must go on.
Before we get into the meat and potatoes of the video, I think it's worth defining where the West and the South are. While this question could be a whole video on its own, for the sake of brevity, we will base the West and the South on the US Census regions. Although the exact geographical boundary won't have a noticeable effect on this topic, now that we have the geography out of the way, let's continue. The question of what constitutes a Western is a question that must be answered before we even touch Django Unchained, as the answer will form a basis of this video. While this question is open-ended, a Western is a rather large genre after all. For the sake of a little simplicity, we will only be going over the basic foundations of what makes a Western. Let's get through the basics first. Obviously, the cowboy with his cowboy hat, his boots and spurs, his leather or cotton shirt and jacket. And finally, his 6-shooter forms the basic unit of a Western. This, however, is where we begin to run into a little trouble. If you noticed, my use of the male pronouns his may seem obvious considering the term cowboy. But why? Why didn't I use cowgirl, or perhaps even cow them? To find the answer, we have to look into the history of not only the cowboy, but the Wild West genre itself. In doing so, we will find the answers to other important elements such as race, landscape, and even the soundtrack accompanying them. So without further ado, let's get into this poorly animated time machine and let's go back to 1902, 20 years after the Wild West had officially closed. Ah, 1902, the beginning of one of the most consequential decades. So why are we here, might you be asking? Wouldn't the Wild West genre have begun before the West itself closed to open settlement? While this is certainly a good question, it misunderstands the Wild West. The Wild West is not an accurate portrayal of what life was like, but instead it's a romanticization of the period. To understand why, we gotta go back to the origin of the genre. The Virginian by Owen Wister is widely viewed as the first Western, setting the foundation that future Westerns would follow. Well, we won't be summarizing the novel, just know that Wister decided to include the straight white male hero, who in the wild untamed land must protect the innocent damsel in distress. These decisions reflected not just Wister's old imperialist and racist attitudes, but society's views as a whole. The late 19th century was a century dominated by anxiety about race, masculinity, and the rise of collective bargaining. This would mean that the Western genre would become the opposite. White, male-dominated, and individualistic became the foundations of the Virginian, and indeed, the Western genre itself. The novel also includes the then territory Wyoming, with its sprawling green sea, its towering mountains, and its dotted forests, has formed the basis for what the West looks like. The small town, too, played an important role in the landscape. The small one-road town with a saloon, dentistry, and even a newspaper all pointed to the idea of a frontier, where the mostly white residents were at the edge of civilization. We won't be going over soundtracks in this section, but later on, The reason for this will hopefully become clear as we reach it. Now that we know what a Western is, how does Django Unchained meet the Western standards? While Django Unchained breaks a lot of Western tropes, such as a black cowboy and being primarily, though not entirely, set in the antebellum South, it still remains firmly in the Western genre. To understand why, let's begin with the obvious, how Django himself dresses. You can clearly see a Western influence in the cowboy hat, his trusty six-shooter, and his Western jacket. You really can't get more Western than that. Or can you? Django's partner, Dr. King Schultz, although not adorned in the typical cowboy outfit, his apparel can be described as Western. Dr. King Schultz's dentist Reagan is also an intelligent nod to the odd way that dentistry has entered the Western myth, partially thanks to Doc Holliday, whose story has some parallel to his own. Another obvious one is the landscape of the movie. While parts of the film shows a Southern plantation landscape, it should be noted that parts of Django Unchained, particularly the mountain scenes, were filmed in none other than Wyoming, the same state that the Virginian is based on. This gives the movie the Western feel in these parts of the movie. Small towns are also used to produce a Western feel, with Daughtry, Texas in particular, giving a small Western town feel. Let's go more in depth with both Django and Dr. Schultz's characters. Besides from their apparel, their jobs as bounty hunters has a long established trope in both Westerns and the historical West as a legitimate way of enforcing the law, is well reflected as the initial drive for their relationship. The damsel in distress trope feeds the main plot of the film, which, as discussed before, is a well-established trope, dating all the way back to the Virginian. Now that we understand how Django Unchained may be classified as a Western, why did Quentin Tarantino decide to make a Western movie set in the antebellum South?
There was this magnificent store in Tokyo that sold soundtracks. And they had a lot of great spaghetti Western soundtracks. So I went down to this store and it was all all CDs. And man, they had spaghetti Western soundtracks that you just couldn't get in America. I couldn't believe it. And so, and they had record albums. I just bought so much. I just looked like a rich asshole. And so I get back to my hotel room and I've had like a day off. I did it on my day off. And I'm just luxuriating in all this like Morricone, Louise Bacalov spaghetti Western music. And it's just so great.
This clip shows Quentin Tarantino explaining where he got his inspiration for Django Unchained. Now you can see why I held off the soundtracks until this part. Soundtracks have played a special role in not only Westerns, but in the Westerness of Django Unchained. Take for example this scene.
And after this, we'll see if you break eggs again.
John Brittle!
As the song La Corsa wills, the audience is given a sense of the valiant cowboy saving the day, as Django calls John Brittle by name. Even when the movie introduces the hip-hop track 100 Black Coffin.
It's for 100 bad men, 100 black grapes so I can lay their ass.
You can clearly hear a Western backing to it, to maintain a level of Westernness to the movie. You may have noticed until now, I have not truly addressed the elephant in the room. The elephant is, of course, the fact that Django is a black character in a genre that, as we have discovered, was created to reinforce a white identity. While Tarantino may have been inspired by the sound of spaghetti westerns, it's his use of revisionist western that exposes why his choice of telling a Italian story in the western genre not only makes sense, but was arguably necessary. Developed by filmmakers such as Sam Peckinpah and Richard Harris in the 1960s, the genre aims to challenge the well-established Western tropes. It aims to bring a more nuanced approach to the Wild West, in both its portrayal of good versus evil and in its ahistorical depiction of the West. It is perhaps with the revisionist Western in mind that Tarantino said,
Westerns reflect the decade in which they were made, more than musicals, more than period dramas, more than even comedies, actually.
A sentiment that is well reflected in Django. As opposed to making a film reflecting the white, male-dominated and individualistic West that had long appealed to white audiences in the 1940s and 50s, he aimed to create a Western that better reflected the more diverse and accurate West. It may shock you, largely thanks to the Western genre, that African Americans played a rather large role in the West, with black cowboys representing an estimated 25% of all cowboys. This brings Django, the bounty hunter cowboy, in a unique position to challenge the Western ideas of race. The fact that the film particularly takes place in the South is also an interesting point that, until now, I have glossed over. The reason for this is simple. Behind the Western glam, Django Unchained is, at the end of the day, a story about the black experience in America. This story is about the unfair treatment of African Americans, a story, while an American story has long been associated as a Southern story. Django Unchained is both a Southern and Western movie that uses both themes to tell and challenge the way that African Americans have been told in American history. Its use of Western themes, in particular, are strong, as this use of the antebellum South is what audiences will often associate with black history, but the West is more often than not ignored in this history. Its use of Western music, landscapes, and most importantly a black man in a cowboy outfit seeks to also reconcile the often split histories of the South and the West, when they in fact occurred at similar times and more importantly, were often entrenched in ideas of white supremacy.
Felt like the weight of the world was on my shoulders.